the best part of the program today, and that is our guest speaker. Catherine didn't give us a lot to introduce her, so it's very simple, but also to remember she has a book outside if you're interested in that. Catherine Vance is a member of the Bay Area UUC, who is a trained interfaith chaplain, a writer, and a candidate to the UU ministry. She attends Iliff School of Theology in Denver. Catherine, we welcome your words.
Well, thank you so much for having me back again. Your theme for the month is generosity, so my talk is about how we think about things and how we can be generous to people and to ourselves just by the way that we manage our thinking. So I want to begin with a reading from Parker Palmer. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a Quaker, and he runs the Center for Courage and Renewal. And this is called Sitting Quietly in the Woods. Like a wild animal, the soul is tough, resilient, resourceful, savvy, and self-sufficient. It knows how to survive in hard places. Yet despite its toughness, the soul is also shy. Just like a wild animal, it seeks safety in the dense underbrush, especially when other people are around. If we want to see a wild animal, we know the last thing we should do is to go crashing through the woods, yelling at it to come out. But if we will walk quietly in the woods and sit really patiently at the base of a tree and kind of fade into the surroundings, the wild creature we seek might make an appearance. We may see it only briefly and out of the corner of our eye. Well, sometimes community often means a group of people who go crashing through the woods, scaring the soul away. So in spaces from congregations to classrooms, and also in community with ourselves, we behave in ways that drive things into hiding. But a circle of trust, which I hope that we are, knows how to sit quietly in the woods and wait for the shy soul to show up. The relationships in such a group are not pushy, but patient. They're not confrontational. They're compassionate. They're not filled with expectations and demands, but with an abiding faith in the reality of that inner teacher and in each person's ability to learn from it. So I want to acknowledge that the inspiration for the sermon today has been gathered from the work of UU minister Reverend Elizabeth Stevens, who wrote her doctoral dissertation on trauma-informed worship. And those words, trauma-informed, are kind of buzzing around today. You see trauma-informed everything, trauma-informed teaching, trauma-informed leaders. You can use it as an adjective in so many places because everywhere we turn, people are hurting, towns, nations, we are all in some kind of pain. I came to be an advocate for the concept in trauma-informed chaplaincy. And what that meant to me was that every time I went into a patient's room, I was aware that that person had not only whatever problem had brought them to the hospital, which in my case was MD Anderson, was a cancer hospital, but they also had a childhood and a life history and a body with a certain regulatory system, because we feel trauma in our bodies, that was influencing them. All of that was influencing them just as much, if not more, than the fact that they were dealing with something that was really life-threatening. So the first time it really hit me, I had gone into the room of a man who, the minute I walked in, he started glaring at me, and he lashed out to me, I just wanted to come and say hello. Well, if you don't mind, he said, if you would just give me 15 minutes to eat this lunch instead of trying to have a conversation. Do you think you could do that for me? And he just seemed so angry at my very appearance in his space that I was really taken aback. And I could feel that negativity hit me right in my chest. But I just said, well, of course, enjoy your meal. I'll swing back later. But to myself, I'm thinking, maybe I'll just happen to get really busy and I won't have to go back there, because I had no clue what was going on to make him respond that way. And I'm not a psychologist or a trained therapist or even a nurse. But if it's your job to be helping people, which chaplains are, our instinct is to keep on trying, but sometimes we just have to step back, right? So for us as members of a congregation, as workers, as neighbors, and as friends, we never know when this unsettledness, these responses might show up, or how it might be lurking under the surface of people's lives. So it helps to kind of expect that it might be there. And so that when conflicts develop in a committee or in traffic, when someone flies off the handle at work, or even gets offended when we're standing in line at the taco place, right? We can respond with care rather than buying into that shock of feeling that we're in the presence of something, if not dangerous, then at least certainly uncomfortable or potentially volatile. Well, Reverend Stephen reminds us that trauma is any sort of an experience that breaks us open or shatters us, our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of how the world works. And so if it's personal, it might be a defined event. It might be a car accident or a fire or a financial crisis, or, as we saw, a death in the family. But it also might be the result of having grown up in uncertainty, growing up in dysfunction, in poverty, or some type of abuse. Those kinds of things don't get openly talked about, but they can make up the bulk of who we are emotionally. And so we carry that with us wherever we go. It's maybe even invisible to ourselves as we carry it around, because we wall those things off so that we can go forward and function. But trauma can also be collective. It can be vicarious pain or associated pain. We see the things that are happening in Israel and Gaza, and we are impacted by that. That's sort of a collective pain. Even in our own Unitarian Universalist world, most recently the firebombing that happened at the UU congregation in Plano, where damage was fortunately minimal, but it triggered fear for a lot of people in our denomination. Trauma can also be historical. So, as the reading showed from Patrick Reyes, right, these things happened to him in the way that he grew up in his culture. He had survived to adulthood. And even though he's doing okay now, all that he and his family and his ancestors, they went through, the racial slurs, the stereotyping, the job opportunities lost, alcoholic relatives, all of those things, that's still right there with him. So even though he is friendly, he's highly educated, he's on the board of Meadville Lombard, right? When his professor said, "Give me the real answer about why you're here," that just really hit him so hard. It was like a match that was held to his skin, because he had survived his childhood. So Stevens goes on to point out that trauma is something in our lives, that rests in our bodies and in our nervous system. And it's not cognitive. It's not always something that you're consciously aware of. It needs to be physically processed. And when it's not, that's when we see people who are acting out of anxiety and hurt and uncertainty. That's when we see people pulling back or creating a wall. That's when we see folks who seem to be overwhelmed by really small things, or maybe resistant to change. Because getting out of a comfort zone, when you've had all this trauma, you need to stay in a comfort zone, in a habit maybe. It often raises some of those old feelings. And so that snarky email that your coworker sent you, that was not really about you. And that person that said hello to you in the grocery store the other day that seemed really distant and didn't want to stop and chat, that was not about you either. And on the other end of the spectrum, you may find people who are complaining a lot, who want to talk a lot and complain about a lot of petty things. Their real pain is buried or even unclear to themselves, and so it just seems to leak out around the edges in a lot of unrelated ways. So here we are, as a congregation, open to many different experiences and ways of being, and in a posture of helping each other, being generous to the world around. But it is helpful to have a conscious awareness that there are big and little trauma landscapes everywhere. So dealing with people in a church setting might exacerbate the pain depending on what is said and done. My seminary, for example, is full of people who have been wounded by their faith communities of origin, their family communities. And as UUs, we tend to be cognizant of that. We know that people who have been hurt by other beliefs and are not welcoming, for example, to people who are gay and trans, they come here to find community. And so coming to church and being together ought to be a way that we can help to ease each other's anxiety. Because, we're really not a punitive family or denomination that has a list of expectations and sins and rules. We're so glad about that. We are suited to being trauma informed. We're a really kind family that just wants everyone to feel supported and peaceful. Well, in therapy speak, sometimes they call that co-regulation. We can just calm each other down. And we often say, it's good to be together. It is good to be together. So we use our words and our rituals to connect us to that part of ourselves where safety and self-confidence and love reside. And sometimes there is an obvious need from the events of the world. A friend of mine, a UU minister, was in charge of a congregation in Colorado last year when there was a shooting at a gay nightclub, and so she pulled together a vigil that had songs and candles with reflection and tears, because folks needed to come together to grieve and to process and to know that this terrible thing had happened, but that there was still love and compassion in the world. And while sadness or fear and anger might be rampant at a given moment, it wouldn't stay that way. So a lot of dealing with trauma is helping people and helping ourselves to kind of see through to the other side. So when things feel broken, community really is often the key to coming through. A lot of times, though, it's not something that is so overt. Sometimes it's just the small daily things and our personal history infringing on the present. And each of us with our own particular burden, our own particular sadness, our own particular story. So when we come here and we find ourselves in this familiar space, an order of service, the lighting of the chalice, the saying of the covenant, an expectation of being welcomed, all those things are of so much use to us because bodies need that comfort. We need that release. We are really a cerebral people, Unitarian Universalists, but we need to realize how much the body is a part of our spirituality. And in a way, we're really just all overgrown kids. We need to have our bath, our teeth brushed, our story read, and the kiss goodnight, and it needs to be in that order or else things get a little bit dicey, right? So those of you who have grandchildren. So here, right here, is a place we can say to each other, just with our kindness and our body language, that you're seen and you're held. Peter Steinke, in his book, The 21st Century Church Family, he addresses the fact that stress and anxiety and trauma and emotionality are extremely present in church systems at times because we do operate like a family. There's a great deal of interrelatedness. Maybe it's the staff and the congregants. Maybe it's in a committee meeting. But often we expect more harmony from each other in a church setting. We think that our ability to keep the peace when we have conflict or arguments and misunderstandings should be greater than ordinary. But really, we're just, as I say, like a family that is subject to all of these same things. So in times of change or loss, in times of growth, in times when a congregation is defining its way forward in new ways, whatever issues or new things might be on the horizon for you to come to terms with, the trauma responses may pop up more than usual. And so when that happens, we need to not just have grace with each other, we need to have grace with ourselves. because trauma-informed congregations are not just aware of each other, we're aware of ourselves. We're self-aware. And we notice the places where our opinions differ. We notice that maybe we have trouble interfacing with a particular person, and our bodies might start to tighten, or we might get a little thought loop going in our head thinking something negative, because this is typical human responses. But what we're actually trying to do is come to terms with what we're feeling, and noticing it consciously may help us to have a better sort of response instead of reacting out of that trigger of emotion. It's self-differentiation. Social workers know this term. It's an important skill to cultivate. It's when we say, I'm a separate person, and I recognize that I have my own needs, my own physical responses to what's going on. So I'm going to own that without blaming it on somebody else or without running away. So in addition to being attuned to reactivity in other people, we're attuned to that reactivity in ourselves. We recognize when we're feeling off center, because our innate trauma responses will trigger us at times to either fight or to stay away. But the sign of an emotionally mature person and an emotionally mature congregation is the ability to tolerate a degree of turmoil and to stay in relationship, to know that we have a shared mission and a vision, and that things will not always be exactly the same, but that we can go through. We don't have to be therapists or psychologists to really understand that. We just have to have some discernment. We have to be able to see whether we're dealing on a personal level or on a congregational level, that when a thing is happening, a certain level of stress is actually a good sign. It's a sign that we're coping well, and that we're changing and we're moving and we're thinking and growing. And so ultimately, we have a knowingness that our love for each other and for Unitarian Universalism as a way of approaching the world is worth the effort. And this is the positive edge of trauma and conflict, the anxiety of change. This is post-traumatic growth in both a personal and a collective way. Whatever we're facing, every crisis or difficult encounter can be an opportunity for an even brighter manifestation of all that we are capable of. We just have to hold to the light and go through to the other side of whatever it is. So as Parker Palmer says, we can be a circle of trust for each other. We can be patient with each other. When difficulties arise, when trauma gets activated in our bodies, many of us have an urge to do something or to fix something or to say something, but sometimes we just need to walk quietly in the woods and sit patiently at the base of the tree and breathe with the earth. And Elizabeth Stevens says that she eventually asks herself or the other person, what do you need? What do you need? And so when I was a chaplain at the hospital, and even though my body was telling me, don't go back to that room, yeah, because I didn't like getting ambushed that way with words that felt like anger and rejection, my heart and my head told me that here was a person that was in pain, and it wasn't about me. So I had to try. And so I went back and I knocked, and then I just waited very quietly just inside the door. And I said, hey, I thought I would just check and see if this is a better time. And I didn't say anything else, but inside myself there was a lot of work going on. I had asked myself, what do you need? And my answer was that I just needed to know that I was brave enough to show up. And I was telling myself that it was okay if he needed me, and it was okay if he kicked me out again. I could self-regulate. I wasn't going to be upset or afraid. I was just going to be happy with myself that I had been open enough and vulnerable enough to risk whatever the outcome would be. I think he felt that I didn't have an agenda. I was just a sitter in the woods waiting for the animal to approach. And sure enough, he said, well, come on over. And he started to talk and to cry. and to explain to me why he had taken such a tone when I first came in. Because the people who were supposed to have been there for him, his family hadn't shown up yesterday. And so I totally gave up the idea that I was going to be able to fix anything for him, that anything at all depended on me. I just listened, and that was all that he really needed. It was for me to let him know that he wasn't alone in his brokenness, and that's what we do for each other. So ultimately, that vision, that visit, which had such potential for separation, was really meaningful to both of us. So lamentation, sorrow can switch so quickly to connection and joy when we are in awareness of ourselves and others. When we are well positioned to embrace whatever lies ahead, we will handle anxiety at a conscious level. We'll recognize it and we'll honor it when it shows up in others, when it shows up in our bodies. We will support each other and be gentle with ourselves whenever we feel tightly wound or triggered. We won't hunker down into denial and try to make painful things go away really fast, because we know that, especially collectively, we do have the strength to tolerate challenges and to be hopeful and curious about the ways in which we can continue to let love be our guide as we share the way to the world. Awareness, just awareness and grace in the face of a big bundle of unsettledness. It's not easy to be an emotional and spiritual anchor, to hold stress while believing in respite and resolution. But the rewards are really great. Yes, they are. Amen.